Okay, thank you. Okay, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 36 and 37. Start with 36. Jesus says, every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words, now listen close, by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words shalt thou be condemned. Condemned, did you catch that? Condemned. That means you can be lost by the words you speak. Now, we all know that by our deeds we cannot be saved. But can we be lost by our deeds? Absolutely we can be lost by our deeds. It might not seem very fair at first if you can't be saved by your deeds, but you can be lost by them. But only a moment of deep thought is all that is required to see the fairness in this. You might spend your whole life in strict obedience to God's law and then slip up just once like Moses did in not speaking to the rock. And you might think that your spotless track record and your perfect score in the past will bail you out of your present little indiscretion. But no, you're guilty, you did the deed, and without confession and forgiveness, you've no hope of eternity. So by your deeds shall you be condemned. One of the deeds you can perform is the things you say. So words are deeds. Just one of the many types of deeds, but nevertheless, the words you speak are part of your deeds. When you perform a deed, your brain has to think about the deed a few milliseconds first before it sends instruction to the body to perform the deed. This is no different with spoken words. You think briefly about what you want to say. You choose the words you wish to use, then the instructions are sent from the brain to the jaws and the tongue to utter the words. Both physical deeds and spoken words are premeditated acts, meaning that you thought about what you were going to do before you did it. You thought about what you were going to say before you said it. Meaning, therefore, that you, and I shouldn't say you, we, include myself here, we are fully accountable for what we do and say. Now, most of us, we do pretty good at controlling our tongues, or at least we like to think we do. But everyone has at some time committed some small verbal indiscretion, said something they wish they hadn't. Maybe we were sharp or impatient. Maybe we threw an insult at someone we figured deserved it. Or maybe we just misrepresented something someone else said and thought they were being nasty to us, so we barked back at them, only later to learn that they weren't being nasty at all, but we were. And we could do a whole series of sermons on how to control those spur-of-the-moment reactions when we are most prone to saying things that Christ would never say. Today, however, we're going to look at Matthew 5:37 from a somewhat different angle. We're going to take a look at the actual words we use when we're in an emotional state, and even in those situations when we're not. Matthew 5:37 says, "Let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil." Now, we just read Matthew 12:36 and 37. It says, "Every idle word that men speak, they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words shalt thou be justified, and by thy words shalt thou be condemned." Or to put it in modern equivalent, Jesus is saying, watch your mouth. Idle words can cost you your eternal life. But what constitutes an idle word? Do we know just exactly what is meant by the expression, an idle word? When it comes to what we say, what is acceptable to God and what is not? I mean, can we never tell a funny joke or an amusing story? Can we never make a pun or some humorous understatement or some ironic quip? Must our conversation always deal with gravely sober, serious matters as we walk around with a Buster Keaton deadpan expression on our face? To promote this interpretation of this text, I believe, would be forcing the scriptures to say something they're not saying. We know that the Lord wants us to be happy. He wants us to take joy in our existence, even here while living on a sin-sick planet. In Galatians 5, verses 22 and 23, the fruits of the Spirit are listed, and joy is the second one on the list. Verse 23 says that against such there is no law. You are free to be happy, free to be joyful. Sometimes, even as adults, we can get a little carried away with joking around and goofing off and making wisecracks. Just come to one of our board meetings and you'll see what I mean. We have a precious brother right here in our own little church who is famous for this, and we all love him for it. I won't mention any names, but his initials are J. Richards. During our board meetings, we often banter with each other, and it creates a mood of warmth and affection between each other. I do not believe that these are the idle words that will condemn us. So what are these idle words? And how do we meet these requirements as we read them from the verses in Matthew? Well, let me tell you a little story that took place when I was in my late teens. My grandfather had it figured out pretty well. He was the head deacon in the United Church in Wyerton, Ontario, and although not an Adventist at the time, he nevertheless took his service to God very seriously. On one occasion, I was helping him dig holes for fence posts. My foot slipped off the shovel and skinned up my ankle bone pretty bad. There was blood, and the skin was peeled back, and, oh man, not a pleasant experience. Now, having grown up in a backward, uncultured part of the country, I let loose with a variety of profane expressions, just like I'd heard from all my non-Christian friends. My father had been a sailor, so some of what I said I'd learned from him as well. But too late I realized I had just subjected my noble Christian grandfather to a vulgarity that he didn't deserve being subjected to. I waited for the booming wrath of an offended grandfather to descend upon me. I was guilty, and I knew it. With a certain fearful looking forward to the wrath to come, all that remained now was the condemnation, no doubt followed by a punishment of some sort. But I guess my grandfather figured I was too old now to punish. Instead, he gently said to me, "Now, did all that swearing make your foot feel any better?" I stared at him for a second and said, "No." "Did it make your foot heal up?" I said, "Of course not." "Did it make you feel better inside?" Being honest, I said, "No, I wish it did, because it still hurts and I'm still mad." Then my grandfather said, "So all that potty mouth didn't accomplish a thing." Like a couple of lazy teenage boys who don't want to work, if they stand around idle, they don't accomplish a thing. Just like those idle boys, words that don't accomplish anything are idle words. Now, God gave us the power of speech so that our words would serve a purpose. Words bear many purposes. Words can improve a bad situation, save a life, convey love, fear, or joy. Words can decide the fate of nations. There is great power in words, and it is our God-given responsibility to ensure that we use them wisely. But words that accomplish nothing are idle words, and we should not be wasting our time and mental energy in employing them in our day-to-day speech. As well, such words can create a very real discomfort in those having to listen, those who don't want to hear that kind of talk. And for this, we will be held accountable. Now, at this point in the sermon, most of you are probably saying, "Oh, well, I don't need to worry about that. I don't use those words," or "I don't talk like that. I don't use profanity." Well, would you be surprised if I told you that we're not so squeaky clean as we might think we are? Because we live in a fallen world, most of us have picked up expressions and sayings that clearly do qualify as idle words. In fact, some of these words gravely dishonor God. Let's take a closer look now at some of these expressions that we engage in so freely without any recognition of how offensive they are to God. The modern textbook name for idle words is expletives. The Gage Canadian Dictionary defines expletives as an exclamation or pronunciation that has no meaning other than to express strong emotion or feeling. Now, there's no sin in giving expression to strong emotions or feelings. We are emotional beings. We're made to experience strong emotion. It's what we do with it that can potentially constitute a sin. As such, idle words can be classified into 4 broad categories. And here is where we deviate from how God intended us to deal with strong emotions. We can utter desecrations and curses, oaths and swearing, vulgarity, or what is called substitutionary profanity. I'll be interested to find out what that is. We're going to take a look at desecration first, and you're going to find that it exists in forms you perhaps were not aware of. This is one category that Adventists, believe it or not, are perhaps more commonly guilty of than any of the other divisions. It most commonly involves the dishonorable or disrespectful use of God's name. Now you might think, oh, I know what he's talking about, people saying GD or GC. Well, certainly those are desecrations. However, God's name is dishonored in more ways than just those two, and more ways than you might think. For example, why is it that when something unusual happens, most people, Adventists or not, just people in the world, they respond by saying, and I'm unpleasant with saying this because I don't want to be accused of taking God's name in vain, but you know the 3 words, oh my God. All right? Whenever a person is surprised, frightened, or disgusted, a lot of people respond by uttering those 3 words. Now, this isn't the only form this expression can take. How many of you here remember the old TV show, The Waltons, from the 1970s? Okay, so I'm not necessarily dating myself. Okay? This program was considered a good, clean, wholesome show promoting values such as honesty, integrity, family, industriousness, high morals, good, clean living, going to church, although it was on Sunday. But in almost every episode, the grandmother, who was cast as perhaps the most religiously devout member of the family, would desecrate the name of God. Whenever irritated, she would utter, "Good Lord," without a moment's reflection on the sin she had just committed. Now, the name of God is rightly used only, and I want you to pay close attention to this, 3 categories. The name of God is only rightly used when you are praising, praying, and preaching. And preaching includes witnessing. Worshiping is the praying. These fall into that category as well. But to use the name of God to express strong emotion, first of all, accomplishes nothing except to dishonor God. And it is therefore sin. The spirit of prophecy says that the angels cringe when they hear the irreverent manner in which God's people use his name. Over the many years in which the Walton show was on TV, the expressions "good Lord," "good God," "Lordy, Lordy," "oh Lord," and "Lord" by itself were used to express surprise, horror, fear, anger, frustration, revulsion, irritation, and annoyance. None of those can be considered acts of worship, praise, praying, or preaching. The free use of these sacred titles, which belongs only to God, was indulged in as though this type of speech was okay with God, so long as the speaker was a Christian. Excuse me. Somehow being Christian made it okay, and that very clearly was the message that was sent to the North American TV viewing audience. So it is used today by Christians as an acceptable alternative to strong language. Now, I won't blame the Waltons for all the misuse of God's name in the world today. I'm sure that many other factors contributed to that. But we cannot ignore the dramatic increase in the use of OMG in the modern world. Just listen to a room full of young girls at a birthday party. When gifts are opened and a young lady experiences the extreme sudden joy of getting something she has always wanted, she immediately expresses that joy with a loud OMG yelled out 3 or 4 times as she dances around the room. Oops, I gotta go back here. I'm getting ahead of myself. Now remember, if it isn't praising, praying, or preaching, it's desecration. The word desecration means to desacredize something, to put it into common usage. But God's name is sacred. So to use it to express joy or surprise or any other strong emotion is to pull it down from the place of honor and reverence that it deserves. And to do this is to sin. Something else that is worth noticing is why people feel they have to use God's name in such a way in the first place. When experiencing that strong emotion, why do people automatically resort to uttering one of the names or the titles of God? Did you ever hear anyone say, "Oh my Lucifer," or "Holy Satan"? Why is it always God's name that gets irreverently misused? When did that start? I have a good close friend who refuses to dishonor God in this matter, and he's not even Adventist. Instead, when he gets upset about something, he just says, "Oh, puppy dogs." It conveys his frustration and his irritation and annoyance in a manner that is humorous and helps to actually alleviate some of the tension. I believe that this irreverent use of God's name is one of Satan's masterpieces in getting human beings to thoughtlessly and automatically, without thinking, desecrate the name of a holy God every time they experience some strong emotion. I mean, what does God have to do with getting a new cell phone for Christmas? How is God involved with getting free tickets to the Oprah Winfrey show? How is God in any way responsible for you and me getting a whopper of an electric bill? Yet I have heard many a long-time Adventist use these desecrations of God's name, including a couple of pastors. And there is another thing that we do too. We give utterance to our feelings by the mention of sacred or sacredizing terminology. Who has not said, "Holy cow"? I looked into the origins of "holy cow." I thought that was a fairly inert, tame saying that, although nonsensical, had no religious context. Was I ever surprised when I found out what it has to do with? When you say "holy cow," the cow mentioned here is the red heifer, the heifer of 3 years old that was burnt as an offering for sin under the old covenant. An offering for sin. Who died as an offering for our sin? Jesus. In the Desire of Ages, E.G. White clearly identifies Jesus as the offering for sin and calls him by that name. When you say "holy cow," you're actually talking about Jesus' death on our behalf. And guess what? It is a desecration. Now, if anyone can find any other source for the origins of "holy cow," please let me know, because that's all I was able to find. Numbers 19 tells us that this cow was to be set aside to serve a holy purpose. I believe it was 14 days, and as such was considered a holy cow. Now, this expression found its origins in Old English, which in its infancy seemed to excel in the desecrations of all things holy. The saying "holy cow" was not invented for the purpose of offending the East Indians. It was in use long before these people came to our country. It was clearly intended as a desecration of the plan of salvation by boorish, godless people. Holy smokes was another one. It's a direct reference to the smoke that rose to God during the burning of sacrifices. Smoke is a biblical symbol for the prayers of the righteous ascending up to God. Holy cow and holy smokes are clear desecrations of elements of God's great plan of salvation for his people, desecration of God himself, and in fact, one should never say holy anything to express strong feelings. It is illogical when something bad happens. Holy mackerel, we used to say when we were kids. That's a fish. What is holy about a fish? But sadly, when in that frame of mind, an upset emotional frame of mind, the word holy is often placed in front of many other words, none of which are holy in any sense of the word, and the use of the word holy by itself to express wonder or amazement is a desecration, as it is almost always uttered in response to some event that is clearly not holy either. Excuse me, please. In French, the word sacré is used as an expletive to designate something holy. Sancto in Spanish, Heilige in German. It seems that all languages and cultures are guilty of this form of desecration. Therefore, when giving expression to our strong feelings, we must be keenly vigilant to avoid giving emphasis to our words through the use of holy names and concepts. God will not hold us guiltless, we are told. Oaths and swearing. Swearing is a broad term that is used to apply to all four categories of improper language, but it actually has a division of its own, which is perhaps a little more benign than you might have at first thought. It's an interesting phenomena. It's quite different from what we've looked at so far, and it is quite another thing perhaps than what we think it is. The act of swearing or taking an oath these are two of the same thing, by the way, and they're done for the purpose of convincing someone that you really, really, really are telling the truth. It's an attempt to get people to believe what you say. You have perhaps heard people say, I swear to God, it's true. Or how about, I swear in a stack of Bibles, that's what I saw. There is this general belief that swearing by something holy will somehow lend more credibility to what we say. Even in the courts of law, they get you to place your hand on a Bible and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And of course, it is nothing more than verbal nonsense. It's all just words, easy to say, and in reality has no real force. It accomplishes nothing. It is a true expletive. In Matthew 5:33 to 37, paraphrasing now, Jesus says just this when he says, not to swear by heaven, by the earth, not to swear by your head, because you can't make one hair of it grow, or by Jerusalem, for you have no power over any of these things. Instead, in verse 34, Jesus says, but I say unto you, swear not at all. It is a pointless exercise, and many courts today have actually dropped this practice of getting people to swear to tell the truth, since there has been an increasing number of people who lie blatantly in court after taking the oath to tell nothing but the truth, so help me God. 50 years ago, the general public had a very real fear and respect for the concept of God and the sacredness of his holy book. But nowadays, as the world has become more materialistic and atheistic, that fear has largely dissipated. And people think nothing of misrepresenting the truth if it gets them out of an unpleasant scenario. So we see here the futility of swearing, not just in this scenario, but in any scenario. Again, in Matthew 23:16 to 22, Jesus relates the foolishness of this practice of swearing on holy objects in order to convince people that you're telling them the truth. He talks about the silliness of swearing by the temple gold, the altar, and by him that dwells in the temple. In other words, God. He doesn't call it profane. He just, and again paraphrasing, he just said basically it's pointless. Well, Jesus doesn't say it's stupid. I say it's stupid, but it is stupid. And it does not in any way make your words more valid or accurate or serve any useful purpose for that matter. And so that's the main reason why we as Seventh-day Adventists do not forswear ourselves. There is, however, another reason for avoiding this practice. In times past, a person might begin telling you something by saying, I swear by all that is holy. I saw this or I heard that. With the passage of time, however, people have dropped the I swear portion and now simply say, by all that is holy, or by God in heaven. In the part of the world I came from, for the purpose of giving emphasis to what they were saying, it was very popular for people to begin a sentence with, by God or by Jesus. This practice was rampant and evolved into the most common method of conveying anger. As a child, whenever I did something wrong, my father would say to me, and I'm going to say this slow because I don't want to sound like I'm swearing, by the Jesus, I'll tan your hide. Now, I didn't know that he was using an oath to convince me that if I did that again, I really would get the whipping of my life. But I did wonder what Jesus had to do with getting a whipping. So you see, what has happened here is that the names and titles of God have once again been invoked to give more force and expression to strong emotions, and we've already established that using God's name for that purpose is offensive to him. It's a desecration. So although there are still those who invoke God's name when making an oath today, such practice has moved largely into the realm of expressing anger and unholy emotion. So now it has become a combination of both desecration and swearing. At this point, some of you are probably going over things you say at home or work, wondering where they fit into all of this. Well, we still have 2 more categories to go. Oh yes, fallen man has sure made up a lot of foul things to say. So the next category is vulgarity. I won't get too expressive here. Vulgarity is the use of expressions and terms that make reference to bodily functions and bodily parts. It does not desecrate God necessarily, but instead, this time around, it desecrates the human beings and corrupts the speaker of the words. Sometimes referred to as bathroom language, it is also known as potty mouth, most commonly used for the purpose of deliberately being as gross and disgusting as possible. Definitely not conveying the image of God in a human being. Satan again has been masterful at convincing people that this is a popular and great way to talk. I spent 4.5 years in the Army. Let me tell you, there was this subculture that genuinely believed that the more vulgar and offensive you could be in your day-to-day speech, every second word was cuckamouth. Why, that was a good thing. You were a real soldier if you could do that. Some even believed it would bring them popularity and win them acceptance with new friends. It seems to be almost exclusively the realm of the male of the species, although we had 4 female recruits who used it freely, but only because they believed they had to in order to be accepted by the rest of the male recruits. More specifically, it refers to, and I'm going to get a bit graphic here, the liquid and solid materials eliminated by the body, leaving our imaginations to fill in the details of appearance and odor and the grossness that comes up in your mind when you hear those phrases and words. Likewise, human sexuality is dragged into this category as derogatory references are made to the organs of reproduction and the many crude names given them. Almost entirely consisting of 4-letter words, what I consider to be the worst are the corrupt references made to the act of intimacy between husband and wife, which is most commonly alluded to by the use of the F word. This was incorporated by the Creator, that is to say, the intimacy between man and woman was incorporated by the Creator into the institution of marriage as the most sacred act that 2 humans could engage in. And by the defiling use of this 4-letter word, its holiness is dragged into the dirt and made a thing of filth. We have as well in our language today a number of words that were once considered entirely acceptable in centuries past, but are no longer so. For example, those words referring to a child born out of wedlock or a female dog. In our modern society, these are considered vulgar by general consensus. To engage in their use now would be to incur the censure and disapproval of society. 1 Peter 2:17 says to honor all people. We are told in Scripture that as much as possible to abide by the consensus of society, for to behave outside those restrictions is to portray oneself as a foul-mouthed rebel, and that is definitely not the image you want if you're going to be giving Bible studies or preaching the gospel. So let us be aware that just because these words bore practical use in times past, this does not justify their use today. Okay. We'll leave this category now, as I actually find this type of talk particularly offensive, but it has to be addressed if we are to give you a complete and cohesive picture of what is expected by our God. We'll do so with a couple of Bible verses first. Ephesians 4:29 reads as follows: "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good." Now, could it be any more direct? Colossians 3:8 says, "But now you also put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, These are the emotions that give rise to profane language. Blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth. There is a heavy commission upon us, ladies and gentlemen, to ensure that the words we speak are pure and untainted. We have had swearing and vulgarity for thousands of years now. It's nothing new. And we will continue to have it until Jesus comes. Until then, we have only to endure it and not use it. Substitutionary swearing. The last category on our study into expletives is the near swearing, or more accurately referred to as substitutionary profanity. This phenomenon involves getting as close as possible to saying the real expletive without actually saying it. Because it's not actually swearing, many feel they are free to engage in it. Right now, some of you might even be thinking, okay, now you're talking to me. Well, I'm not so innocent in this category either. In fact, I have a legacy of a lifetime of near or substitutionary profanity. Sometimes when in the pressure cooker, something will slip out. And there have been plenty of people who've heard me do that. But it doesn't mean that I can't recognize the truth and preach it, right? When someone uses the term GD, and I'm only going to use the initials here because I believe you all know what I'm referring to. When someone utters that curse in its full form, it is in essence saying, I hope God condemns you or damns you. Condemn and damn mean the same thing. So they are saying that they want you to be lost, which is indicative of the cruelest hate that one human can have for another. So this curse is particularly offensive to God because it constitutes a prayer to him that he condemn that person that has been cursed by his fellow man. What a corrupt prayer. However, like every other expletive, the meaning of this phrase has now been extended to bring down curses on non-human objects, such as a car when it won't start, or things when they break, bad weather, things that aren't there when you need them, and things that are there when you don't, like mosquitoes and black flies, and just about everything else when you run out of all the other corrupt words to, once again, express your anger or annoyance. But my mother hated it when my father would use GD. It was just another word to him, and he used it whether he was angry or not, in just calm conversation. Now, Mom, she didn't believe that God's name deserved to be desecrated like that. So instead, when she was experiencing strong emotion, she would resort to the use of words that sort of sounded like it, but weren't exactly. She'd say things like, oh, dang it all, gall dang, gosh darn, oh gosh, golly geez, or just geez, or ye gads every once in a while, little England coming in there, and a host of others. Then she had what she called her JC words. These were words that started with J and K, the sound that the name Jesus Christ starts with. So she'd say, oh, Jiminy Cricket, oh, Johnny Cake, cheese and crackers, crepes, for crying out loud. And that was a replacement for Christ's sake. Oh, Jiminy, oh, Criminy, oh, Jeepers, and a host of others, including Holy Christmas, Holy Crow, and Holy Crap, which I think a lot of us have said. They got the CR sound there. Christmas, crow, and crap all start with CR. The same first two letters of the word Christ. They all sound like desecration of God's and Jesus' names, but aren't. There was an active trade going on between the other mothers in the neighborhood that I grew up in, so that as one learned a new word, they would share it with all the other mothers, so they'd all be up to date on the latest corruption of God's names. But not actually, and without actually saying them. Now, I have by no means given the full list of words and expressions that fall into this category, and every year I hear a selection of new ones that some clever mind has thought up. But the question you have to ask is, are they idle words? They aren't desecrations, they aren't curses, they aren't vulgarity or swearing. And they're meek enough that I can say them here from the altar, and most people don't get overly offended. I even heard some of you laughing out there. Now, I know that you know that I'm going to tell you that they are indeed idle words. But in order to explain why they are, let me tell you another little story. In the year 2000, I took my teenage son Neil with me to Loma Linda, California for his 14th birthday. Our first Sabbath there, we went to the Young People's Sabbath School, one of 5 in the Loma Linda church. Most of the young folks there were a little older than my son, around 18 and 20. Up front, cooing into the microphone sensuously, was a curvaceous young blonde girl in a very tight dress. She was swaying her body slowly from side to side, with her head tilted back and her eyes closed. In a very Marilyn Monroe-type voice, she dreamily slurred out the words so that most people in the room couldn't really make out what she was saying, or singing for that matter. From time to time, she would punctuate her singing with what sounded like a little cries or bursts of ecstasy, accompanied by a giggling smile. The eyes of every male in the room were fastened on her, including my 14-year-old son. In the background, a grunge rock band was loudly grinding out their music, all of them dressed in the t-shirts and toques that made up the uniform of the most popular grunge rock bands of the day. In time to the music, the bass player was thrusting his head forward and backward with such force, I thought surely he was going to dislocate a vertebrae in his neck. So there they stood, eyes covered by hair and toques, hips thrust forward to project the electric guitars they were abusing in order to create this unholy bedlam. The band members all had their tattoos, the untied shoes and torn jeans, and long shaggy hair that was just expected of a grunge rock band. In fact, they had the look down pat as they rhythmically thrust their pelvises forward with each beat of the music, if it could be called that. These young folk were clearly in love with the grunge rock lifestyle and the image of rebellion that it stood for. As the music began to slow down for the ending, I finally caught the last few lines of the words to the song. Yes, Jesus loves me, the Bible tells me so. As the words were dragged out and the drums were hammered and the guitars strummed furiously into distortion. The group of young people there applauded enthusiastically as if this was the best music they'd ever heard in their lives. Talk about your low standards. My son couldn't stand it anymore and asked if we could go somewhere else. So what's the point to this story? Well, it's like this. What did these young people love more? Was it Jesus or grunge rock music? Popularity or separation from the world? Attention to themselves or the worship of God? If you love something so much that you feel you have to dress like it, move like it, sound like it, and behave like it, that's love. We want to dress like Jesus, well, modestly, that is to say, follow his example in modesty. We want to talk like Jesus, sound like Jesus, do as Jesus did and Jesus said. That's love for Jesus. But if your commitment to grunge rock music falls along those lines, then don't insult God by pretending that your music is worship when your image is that of rebellion. Don't desecrate a Sabbath by using it as a venue to perform acts of lewdness and sensuality, then try to convince everyone that it was worship. I remember thinking to myself, if you love grunge rock so much that it pervades your whole philosophy, why don't you just go and join that culture and get it out of your system? And so it is with substitutionary swearing. Don't try to sound like those of the world who engage in full-blown profanity and prevarication. Then in the same breath, you turn around and claim, my heart belongs to God. If you feel an attraction to behaving and speaking like folks of the world, you'll probably find greater satisfaction in joining them and keeping company with them. But when you genuinely love the Lord God with all your heart, when you can't wait to see his face, hear his voice, to be there in person, to see his smile, to feel his actual arm around you, there is no way you will ever want to say anything that sounds remotely like a desecration, or anything that sounds like swearing, or a curse, or sounds like vulgarity. You will want never to offend your God by even getting close to what those words sound like. It will literally be the furthest thought from your mind. Such behavior would be repulsive to you. In this sense, then, we can see that substitutionary swearing is indeed idle words, and is therefore condemned by God, as these words make a clear and perverse inference to the desecration, swearing, vulgarity, and curses of genuine profanity. Well, once again, I've probably subjected you to information overload, and it's probably time to wrap it up. So I will leave you with two Bible verses. The first comes from Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. And our last verse is a reminder from earlier in the sermon, Matthew 5:37, which says, let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. And we've seen very clearly today how that is so. The purpose of this sermon has been to outline one of the many ways in which we can honor the God who has given his life to give us eternal life. We owe him everything. And to use the profanity that I have talked about today, by the way, there's many forms of profanity that we haven't actually talked about, and we're not going to get into that. But this sermon is intended to honor God and to encourage everyone here to do so by paying close attention to what we say on the street from day to day, even when we don't think anybody is listening.